type, color, white space, photographs. These are the elements of newspaper design, and the history of that design is as much a history of newspaper technology as it is a look at the changing role of a creative process. In America, during the passions of the Revolution, Isaiah Thomas, the printer patriot, understood that type alone could arouse the spirit and feelings of readers. Thomas's Massachusetts Spy used a radical display of type and a nameplate engraved by a silversmith, name of Paul Revere. From today's perspective, there wasn't a whole lot of design in the newspaper designs of the late 18th century, but then there wasn't much a printer could do with hand-set movable type, although that was a major improvement on quill pens and parchment. As for press speed, a hand press could print 200 impressions an hour, or 100 sheets printed both sides. It's no wonder a paper's circulation was modest indeed. Most papers were single, folded sheets and had 2 columns of type on a page. Artwork? Hardly, other than the occasional ornamental letter, a touch that's still around. Newspapers flourished after the Revolution. The early versions of desktop publishers were quite common. The papers looked pretty much like their English cousins, perhaps because they were printed on English-built presses using Caslin type. As the country grew, so did the demand for more and larger newspapers. Papers used cylinder presses and steam power in the early part of the 19th century and could now print 2,000 impressions an hour. But the press was still hand-fed. The solemn rows of type offered readers plenty of information, often in as many as 1,000 lines of agate, which must have been hard going. This didn't really matter because we were hungry for information, and newspapers were the only game in town. Newspaper design was essentially a function of holding the page together on the press. The type revolving presses used in the middle of the century required type to be locked into forms by wedge-shaped column rules. For the type to stay in place, the rules needed to run from the top of the page to the bottom. Multiple column headlines were not technically possible. Even after the development of the rotary press and the curved stereotype plate made horizontal multiple column layout possible, the traditional vertical layout endured well into the 20th century. Adventurers we are not. The war against Mexico, the gold rush, and the Civil War stimulated the development of truly American newspapers unlike those published in other parts of the world. Editors began to put order to their stories. Headlines were introduced and even illustrations, which were usually wood blocks. Papers like Hearst's Journal and Pulitzer's World, fighting for circulation in the 1890s, produced radical front pages. War prompted editors to find bigger and bigger headlines. With the improvement of press technology and methods to bring visuals to the printed page, newspapers began experimenting with photography and other engraved illustrations. And in 1918, in what might be the first example of newspaper research, the New York Herald Tribune, after conducting an eye track study, changed its headlines from all caps to capitals and lowercase. The editors decided that the new head was considerably more readable. That's still true. The development of the engraved halftone had a tremendous impact on design, leading to the creation of a new type of newspaper. Much in the manner of USA Today, taking advantage of color and satellite page delivery, the New York Daily News seized upon photography and conjured a graphic recipe that made it the highest circulation newspaper in the country by the 1920s. The 30s represented a turning point visually for newspapers. Many began striving for respectability and professionalism in both presentation and content. Experiments in typography, especially John Allen's work with streamlining and modernizing the Los Angeles Times, became commonplace. Flush left headlines, larger body type, a greater use of white space. But the same decade also saw a slowing of technological advances. In the 40s, with newsprint in limited supply because of World War II, tight newsholes were common. This provided meager opportunity for tinkering. Not until the late 1960s and 70s did newspaper design enter a new phase. Competition between television and print media increased. Newspapers added new sections and features to entice readers. Advancements in offset printing allowed for typographical and photographic clarity. With the arrival of cold type, the limitations of a metal slug in a metal form were eliminated. Newspapers could look like magazines, if that's what they wanted. Front page story count of 12 or 14 was down to 5 or 6. The catchphrase was the dominant image, and poster covers took over feature fronts. As the year 2000 beckons, what technological wizardry will change the way we design newspapers? Will there be facsimile papers? What about front page advertisements and rub-off lotto games? Fewer pictures? More pictures? The next design innovations will depend on the next technological innovations. Once there's a fax machine in every home, and who's to say there won't be, we'll need designers who know how to make an effective fax newspaper. If you ask 20 newspaper designers about what the newspaper of the future ought to look like, you'd probably get 21 prototypes. When the American Press Institute did ask some of the top designers what they saw for the front page in 2000, many visualized elements very much in common with today's paper. But most also saw a shift in design priorities from flash and glitz to style and substance, from color photos of children with balloons to news photos in color. Among other predictions, these designers saw vertical layout, remember? The biggest picture or graphic element in the middle of the page. More summaries, clearer and tighter departmentalization, smaller headlines, more color, a restrained use of typography, tighter formats, much like news magazines. Design has always followed content and technology. So we must assume that many of the changes made in tomorrow's newspapers will result from the changes editors make to attract and keep their customers. And that, surely, is the only way to do it.